The only sound in the dimly lit room was the soft, rhythmic press of skin against the cool leather of the therapy table, a sound punctuated by ragged, stolen breaths. His desk lamp cast long shadows across the walls, turning the professional, sterile space of his practice into something clandestine, something sacred and profane all at once. His mind screamed at him, a frantic litany of every rule he was breaking, every ethical line he was destroying, but his body refused to listen. Her scent, a faint mix of lavender and rain, filled his senses, erasing 10 years of restraint, 10 years of carefully constructed professionalism. Her fingers dug into the muscles of his back, not with pain, but with a desperation that mirrored his own. He lowered his head, his lips finding the delicate skin of her neck, and whispered her name, a name that was both a prayer and a curse. Isabella, Mrs. Rossi. We can't. We shouldn't. The words were a ghost of a protest, a final, futile attempt to hold on to the man he was supposed to be. She shifted beneath him, a soft, broken sound escaping her lips as she arched against him, chasing a pleasure that was laced with so much pain. Her voice was thick, a raw whisper in the near darkness. Don't call me that. Not now. Her hand came up, tangling in his hair, pulling him closer, demanding more. Please, Ethan, don't stop. And with those words, the last thread of his resistance snapped. He was no longer Dr. Carter, and she was no longer his patient. They were just a man and a woman, caught in a storm that had been brewing for a decade. Later, long after she had dressed in the shadows and slipped out into the Boston night, Ethan stood alone, staring out the floor-to-ceiling window of his office. The city lights blurred into a meaningless constellation below. He still felt the ghost of her touch on his skin, tasted the salt of her tears on his lips. How had it come to this? How had the quiet, disciplined life he had built for himself shattered so completely? It had all started 3 months ago, on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday afternoon, when his receptionist announced a new patient, a referral for physiotherapy, a shoulder injury from a minor car accident, and then she had walked in, and his carefully ordered world tilted on its axis. Because it wasn't just any patient, it was Isabella Rossi. A married woman, yes, his patient, yes. But before all of that, she had been his high school English teacher, the impossible, beautiful woman he had watched with silent adoration from the front row 10 long years ago. It began on a Tuesday, a day so relentlessly ordinary that its memory would later feel like a cruel joke. The air in Ethan's clinic was just as he designed it to be clean, smelling faintly of linen and antiseptic, a calm, controlled environment where pain was measured, managed, and methodically reduced. He moved through the hushed hallways with a quiet confidence that his patients found reassuring. This clinic was his sanctuary, a testament to a decade of grueling work, a physical manifestation of the disciplined man he had forced himself to become. He was Dr. Carter, a name etched in frosted glass on the front door, a title that felt both entirely natural and like a costume he had yet to fully grow into. He was reviewing the chart for his 2 o'clock patient when his receptionist's voice crackled through the intercom. Dr. Carter, your 2:30 is here and checked in. Isabella Rossi. I've put her in exam room 3. He clicked his pen, murmuring a quick thank you. The name didn't register. Rossi was common enough in Boston, and his mind was on the complex case of sciatica he had just been dealing with. He picked up the new patient's file, a slim manila folder containing only an intake form, and walked toward room 3, his mind already formulating the standard questions. The routine of his profession, a comforting rhythm. He pushed the door open, a practiced, gentle smile already forming on his face. Good afternoon, Mrs. Rossi. I'm Dr. Form. Carter, it's a pleasure to... The words died in his throat. The world seemed to slow down, the ambient sounds of the clinic fading into a dull, distant hum. Sitting on the edge of the examination table was a ghost from a past he had carefully packed away, a ghost that had haunted the back corners of his mind for 10 years. She was older, of course. There were fine lines around her eyes, almost invisible, unless you were looking for them, and a certain weight in her posture, a subtle weariness that hadn't been there a decade ago. But it was unmistakably her. The same cascade of dark, chestnut hair, though now styled in a more sophisticated cut that grazed her shoulders. The same intelligent, dark eyes that could hold a classroom of restless teenagers captive. The same elegant curve of her lips. She was wearing a cream-colored silk blouse and tailored gray trousers, her hands resting in her lap, a simple gold wedding band on her left finger. She looked up as he entered, her expression neutral, the polite look of a patient meeting their doctor for the first time. And then, as he stood frozen in the doorway, her eyes narrowed slightly. A flicker of confusion, then disbelief, and finally, a slow, dawning recognition that made her sit up a little straighter. "Ethan," she said, her voice a soft, incredulous whisper. "Ethan Carter? Is that really you?" His heart hammered against his ribs, a wild, frantic beat that betrayed the calm exterior he struggled to maintain. He felt a hot flush creep up his neck, the same blush that used to betray him in her 12th grade English class whenever she called on him. He swallowed, forcing himself to close the door behind him, the soft click echoing the sudden closing off of his composure. "At Mrs. Rossi," he managed to say, his voice a little hoarse. "Wow. Yes. It's been a long time." The name felt foreign and strange on his tongue. For years, she had been a fixed star in his adolescent universe, the unattainable Mrs. Rossi. Now, the name created an immediate, awkward barrier between the doctor he was and the boy he had been. He was Dr. Carter. She was Isabella Rossi, his patient. The chasm between those two realities felt immense and terrifying. He forced himself to move, to walk over to the small stool across from her, his movements stiff. He opened the file, pretending to read the intake form he hadn't even glanced at, using the clipboard as a shield. "So," he began, his voice straining for a professional tone, "it says here you're experiencing some pain in your left shoulder. Can you tell me what happened?" As she began to speak, her voice, that voice, the one that had once explained the tragic beauty of Gatsby and the dark passions of Macbeth, pulled him back in time. She described the car accident, a simple rear-end collision at a traffic light a week prior. She spoke of the initial jolt, the stiffness that had worsened over the days, the sharp, radiating pain that now made it difficult to sleep. And as she spoke, Ethan's mind was a chaotic split screen. One half, the doctor, was dutifully taking notes, nodding, asking clarifying questions. Dull ache or sharp pain? Any numbness in the fingers? Does raising your arm above your head make it worse? The other half of his mind was 16 again, sitting in the front row of her classroom, hanging on her every word. He remembered the way she would push a stray strand of hair from her face as she searched for the perfect word, the scent of chalk dust and old books that clung to the air around her, the passion in her voice when she read a line of poetry aloud. He had been utterly, hopelessly infatuated. It was a silent, worshipful crush that he had never spoken of to anyone, a secret fire that had fueled his own love of literature and, in a strange way, his ambition to become someone she might one day see as more than just another face in the crowd. And now, here she was, not on a pedestal at the front of a classroom, but on his examination table, vulnerable, in pain, and looking at him for help. The power dynamic had been inverted so completely it left him dizzy. "Okay," he said, finally looking up from his notes, forcing his gaze to be clinical. "I'm going to need to do a physical examination now, just to assess your range of motion and pinpoint the source of the inflammation. Is that all right?" "Of course, doctor," she replied, a faint, almost nervous smile on her lips. The word doctor from her mouth was another small shock to his system. He stood up and moved towards her, his mind racing. He was a professional. He touched people all day, every day. It was his job. His hands were tools, instruments of his trade. But as he stood beside her, his professionalism felt like a thin sheet of ice over a raging ocean. "I'm just going to gently palpate the area around the shoulder joint," he explained, his voice low and steady, more to convince himself than her. He reached out, his fingers hesitating for a fraction of a second before making contact with the warm, soft fabric of her silk blouse. And then, his fingertips found her skin, just above her collarbone. A jolt, subtle but undeniable, shot through him. Her skin was just as soft as he had imagined it might be all those years ago. He could feel the slight tremor that ran through her at his touch, a barely perceptible tensing of her muscles. He focused, forcing his mind to become a map of anatomy: deltoid, rotator cuff, supraspinatus tendon. He worked with practiced gentleness, his fingers probing for knots of tension, for points of inflammation, his thumb rotating in small circles to gauge her response. "Any pain here?" he asked, his voice a clinical murmur. "A little," she breathed, her eyes closing for a moment. He was so close he could smell the faint, clean scent of her shampoo, see the delicate pulse beating at the base of her throat. For a dizzying moment, the sterile exam room, the anatomical charts on the wall, and the last 10 years all melted away. There was only the warmth of her skin under his fingers, the quiet sound of her breathing, and the frantic, forbidden rhythm of his own heart. He pulled his hand back more quickly than was probably necessary. "Okay," he said, clearing his throat and taking a step back, putting distance between them once more. "It seems like a classic case of whiplash-associated shoulder strain. Nothing a few weeks of targeted therapy shouldn't be able to resolve." He outlined the treatment plan, the words coming out on autopilot. When he was finished, he looked at her, and she was already looking at him, a complex, unreadable expression in her eyes. "I never would have imagined," she said softly, "you becoming a doctor. You were always so quiet in class, always just listening." He allowed himself a small, genuine smile. "I guess I was paying attention," he said. The words hung in the air between them, laden with a double meaning that they both understood. He walked her to the reception desk to schedule her next appointment. As she turned to leave, she paused. "It was good to see you, Ethan," she said, forgoing his title. "You too, Mrs. Rossi," he replied, the old name slipping out instinctively. She smiled, a real, sad smile this time, and then she was gone. Ethan walked back to the empty exam room and stood in the middle of the floor, the faint scent of her perfume, the only evidence she had ever been there. His professional calm was gone, replaced by the chaotic return of a boy's impossible dream, and he knew, with a terrifying certainty that settled deep in his gut, that his life had just become irrevocably complicated. The 3 days between her first and second appointment were a trial. Ethan threw himself into his work, taking on extra patients, staying late to review files, anything to keep his mind occupied. He went through the motions of his life with a forced, rigid discipline. He ran an extra 2 miles in the mornings, drank his coffee black, and spoke to his staff in clipped, efficient sentences. He was constructing a fortress around himself, brick by mental brick. The rules of engagement were simple, absolute, and non-negotiable. He would be Dr. Carter. She would be Mrs. Rossi. Their conversations would be confined to the precise geography of her injury, the acromion process, the glenohumeral joint, the patterns of her pain. Their history was an unexploded bomb, and he would simply pretend it wasn't there. He was a man of science, of anatomy, and kinesiology. He would reduce her to a collection of muscles, tendons, and bones. It was the only way he could survive her presence. When she walked in that Friday afternoon, his fortress immediately felt like it was made of sand. She was wearing a soft gray cashmere sweater and dark jeans, clothes that were casual and comfortable for a therapy session, but on her, they looked impossibly elegant. She smiled at him, a small, polite gesture, and the foundations of his resolve began to crumble. "Dr. Carter," she said, her voice even. "Mrs. Rossi," he replied, his own voice tight. He led her back to the private treatment area, a spacious room with a padded table, complex-looking machinery, and a large window overlooking a small, manicured garden. The air was thick with a tension that was entirely separate from the clinical atmosphere he so carefully cultivated. He started the session with a few minutes on a stationary bike to warm up her muscles, using the time to review her chart, his eyes on the paper but his entire awareness fixed on her. He could hear the soft whir of the pedals, the whisper of her breathing. He was acutely aware of the way she held her shoulders, the gentle sway of her hair. "Okay," he said, forcing a professional briskness into his tone. "Let's start with some passive range of motion stretches. If you could lie on your back for me here." She complied without a word, her movements graceful as she settled onto the table. The proximity was immediate and jarring. To do his job correctly, he had to be close, his body often bracing hers. He began to gently lift her injured arm, his one hand cradling her elbow, the other resting flat against her shoulder blade to stabilize it. The cashmere of her sweater was sinfully soft under his palm, and through it, He could feel the radiating warmth of her body, the subtle, solid landscape of her back. He tried to disconnect, to become a machine. Assess for catching or clicking in the joint. Note the degree of elevation before the patient reports pain. Subscapularis is likely tight. But his mind was a traitor. It wasn't thinking about the subscapularis. It was thinking about the faint, clean scent of her perfume that rose to meet him. It was noticing the tiny, vulnerable pulse beating in her neck. It was remembering the way she used to lean against her desk while teaching, her passion for the words she spoke making her seem larger than life. Now, she was here, under his hands, quiet and trusting. "All right, Mrs. Rossi, I'm going to bring your arm across your chest now," he explained, his voice a low murmur. "Just try to relax the muscle completely. Let me do all the work. You'll feel a stretch deep in the back of your shoulder. Let me know if it becomes sharp." He moved her arm slowly, deliberately, watching her face for any sign of discomfort. Her eyes were closed, her dark lashes resting against her cheeks. A small sigh escaped her lips as the muscle pulled. It wasn't a sound of pain, not exactly. It was a sound of release, of tension letting go. And the sound went straight through him, bypassing every professional barrier he had erected. For the next 20 minutes, they continued this silent, intimate dance. He would move her, stretch her, his hands learning the contours of her body through the layers of her clothing. His touch was always precise, clinical, targeting specific muscle groups, yet every point of contact felt charged with a dangerous electricity. He was a professional, but he was also a man, and the boy inside him who had worshipped this woman from afar was screaming. He moved on to some manual resistance exercises where she had to push against his hand. He knelt beside the table to get the right angle, his face now level with hers. "Okay, now gently try to push your arm outwards." "Against my hand," he instructed. She turned her head to look at him, and their eyes met. For a moment, the sterile clinical context vanished. He was just Ethan, and she was just Isabella, and they were 2 feet apart, locked in a gaze that held a decade of unspoken history. He saw confusion in her eyes, and something else he couldn't name. Curiosity? He broke the gaze first, looking down at her shoulder. "Good. Now relax." The session continued. They found a rhythm, a strange space where the clinical and the personal bled into one another. The conversations remained focused on her recovery. He gave her instructions for exercises to do at home, using a resistance band. "You'll want to anchor this in a door jamb," he said, handing her the coiled piece of rubber. "Twice a day, 15 repetitions." She took it from him, her fingers brushing his. She looked at the band in her hand, a small, weary sigh escaping her. "I'll manage," she said, almost to herself. Then she looked up at him. He's traveling for work again. The house is quiet." It was the first crack in her perfect facade, the first glimpse of the woman behind the patient. It was delivered quietly, without self-pity, but the implication was clear. Mark was her husband, and he was gone, and the house was not peaceful or relaxing. It was quiet, empty. The professional, Dr. Carter, should have offered a neutral, polite response. "I see. Well, these exercises are important for your recovery," but Ethan Carter, the man, simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement that he had heard what she wasn't saying. He filed the information away, a crucial piece of a puzzle he didn't want to admit he was trying to solve. He finished the session by applying a hot pack to her shoulder. As she sat on the edge of the table, he draped a thin towel over her and placed the warm, heavy pack against her back, his hands shaping it to her body. As he did, his fingers lingered for a barest fraction of a second on the warm cashmere covering her shoulder blade. It was an infinitesimal pause, a hesitation so slight that it could have been his imagination. But she didn't move. She didn't pull away. She simply sat there, her back straight, breathing slowly. In that shared stillness, the professional boundary he had fought so hard to maintain felt paper-thin, almost transparent. The unspoken was deafening. The session was over, and he had followed all his rules. He had called her Mrs. Rossi. He had kept the conversation clinical. He had done his job. But as he stood alone in the treatment room after she left, the lingering warmth from her body still radiating from the table, he knew with a cold, sinking feeling that he was failing completely. It was during their fifth session that the first real crack appeared, not in the careful facade of their interactions, but in the very fabric of the reality they were trying to maintain. The appointment was his last of the day, a fact that had hummed with a low-grade, anxious energy in the back of Ethan's mind since morning. Throughout the session, he was hyper-aware of her. He noticed she was quieter than usual, her responses to his questions more subdued. There were new, faint shadows under her eyes, and a tension in her jaw that had nothing to do with her physical injury. He guided her through the exercises, his touch as professional as ever, but his mind was a storm of unasked questions. He finished by applying an ultrasound wand to her shoulder, the cool gel and the low hum of the machine filling the silence between them. As he worked, he watched the sky outside the large treatment room window turn from a placid late afternoon blue to a bruised, ominous gray. The wind began to pick up, rattling the leaves of the small maple tree in the garden. Just as he was wiping the last of the gel from her skin, the heavens opened. Rain fell, not in drops but in solid, wind-driven sheets, lashing against the glass with a sudden, startling violence. A low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. "Well," he said, pulling the towel away, "it seems the weather has decided to make a statement." Isabella sat up, looking at the downpour with a sigh. "I should have checked the forecast." She looked genuinely weary, as if the thought of battling the storm to get home was one burden too many. All his staff had already left for the day. The clinic was silent, save for the drumming of the rain. They were utterly alone. Every instinct for self-preservation told Ethan to keep it simple, to say goodnight, to let her wait in the reception area until it passed. But he couldn't. The sight of her, small and tired against the backdrop of the raging storm, broke through his carefully constructed defenses. "You can't go out in that," he said, the words coming out with more warmth than he'd intended. "It looks like it's settling in for a while. Why don't you wait it out? I can make some coffee. Or tea, if you prefer." The offer hung in the air, a clear deviation from their established script. It was no longer a doctor speaking to his patient. It was a man speaking to a woman. She looked at him, her dark eyes, searching his for a moment, and then a small, grateful smile touched her lips. "Tea would be lovely," she said softly. "Thank you, Ethan." The sound of his first name, spoken so naturally, sent another jolt through him. He led her from the clinical sparseness of the treatment area, down the quiet hallway to his personal office. The space was his refuge, warmer and more intimate than the rest of the clinic. The walls were lined with bookshelves, medical texts, and anatomical journals interspersed with worn paperbacks of novels, Hemingway, Faulkner, and yes, even Fitzgerald. A large oak desk sat before a window that was now a cascade of running water, and two comfortable leather armchairs were angled towards it. He switched on his small desk lamp, casting a warm, golden glow that pushed back against the gloomy twilight outside. The room immediately felt like a sanctuary, a small, safe bubble insulated from the storm. As he went to the small kitchenette in the staff break room to boil water, he could feel his heart beating a little too fast. This was a mistake. This was a breach of every conceivable protocol. When he returned with two steaming mugs, she was standing by the bookshelf, her fingers lightly tracing the spine of a well-read copy of The Great Gatsby. "I remember how you taught this," he said, his voice quiet as he handed her a mug. "You made it feel alive. I think it's the reason I still read." She turned, taking the mug, her fingers brushing his for a moment. She looked at the book, then at him, a sad, nostalgic smile on her face. "I was a different person then," she said, her voice barely a whisper, full of romantic notions. They settled into the armchairs, the rain a constant percussive soundtrack outside. For a while they didn't speak, simply sipping their tea, the silence comfortable rather than awkward. It was she who broke it. "You were right," she said, staring into the depths of her mug. "When you asked if I was distracted today." He waited, not wanting to push. He just looked at her, letting her know he was listening. "It was my anniversary yesterday," she said, the words flat, devoid of celebration. 12 years. "Congratulations," he offered, the word feeling hollow and inadequate. She gave a short, mirthless laugh. "Thank you, Mark. My husband. He meant well. He bought me a necklace. Diamonds. Very expensive. She paused, tracing the rim of her ceramic mug. He had his assistant pick it out. He was home for maybe 2 hours before he had to leave for a dinner meeting with a client. We never even had a drink together. The confession, so simple and yet so devastating, filled the cozy office with a profound sadness. He could see the whole scene, the velvet box on the table, the obligatory kiss, the empty chair across from her at dinner. Sometimes, she continued, her voice dropping lower, her gaze still fixed on the mug, as if it held all the secrets of the universe. I feel like I'm a part of the decor in my own house. Something beautiful to be maintained, polished, and shown off when necessary, but not really seen. Do you know what I mean? He did. More than he wanted to admit. He saw it in the weariness behind her eyes, in the forced brightness of her smile. He was no longer seeing Mrs. Rossi, the brilliant, confident teacher who had held him spellbound. He was seeing Isabella, a woman adrift in a sea of loneliness, clinging to a life that looked perfect from the outside but felt empty within. The desire he felt for her, which had started as a resurrected teenage crush, a physical yearning, was changing. It was deepening, twisting into something far more potent and dangerous, an emotional connection. He felt a fierce, primal urge to reach across the space between them, to take her hand, to tell her that he saw her, that he had always seen her. But he stayed silent, rooted to his chair, knowing that a single touch would be an irrevocable step over a cliff. He's not a bad man, she added quickly, as if feeling guilty for her honesty. He's a good provider, he's just busy. We're different people now. We're like two ships that happen to be docked in the same harbor, but we're not sailing together anymore. The rain began to soften, its frantic drumming easing into a steady, gentle patter. The spell was breaking. The real world was waiting just outside the door. She seemed to notice it too, taking a final sip of her tea and placing the mug on his desk. "It's letting up," she said. "I should go." They stood, the warm intimacy of the last half hour evaporating, leaving a charged, awkward silence in its wake. At the office door, she turned to him. "Thank you, Ethan," she said, and her eyes held his. "For the tea. And for listening." "Anytime," he replied, his voice thick. And in that moment, as they stood there, bathed in the soft lamplight with the storm dying outside, the line between doctor and patient, between past and present, between right and wrong, blurred into almost nothing at all. He had seen the first crack, and he knew with a terrifying certainty that he wanted to break the whole thing wide open. The rain had eased from a roar to a persistent, melancholic whisper, but the world outside the clinic's glass doors was still a wash of gray and glistening black. Isabella stood at the entrance, hugging her arms as if warding off a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature, her gaze fixed on the slick, empty street. Ethan came up behind her, the silence of the empty reception area amplifying the sound of his own unsteady heartbeat. The fragile bubble of intimacy they had created in his office had popped, leaving them in the stark, awkward reality of their situation. A doctor, a patient, and a chasm of unspoken things between them. "I can call you a car service," he offered, his voice sounding unnaturally formal. "It'll be here in a few minutes. You shouldn't have to wait outside." She turned her head slightly, not quite looking at him. "Thank you. You've done more than enough." There was an edge to her voice, a note of finality, as if she were trying to rebuild the walls that had crumbled just moments before, but he couldn't let it end like this. He couldn't bear the image of her climbing into a stranger's car, her face etched with that profound loneliness, to be driven back to a house that was not a home. It felt like an abdication of a duty he didn't know how to define, but which felt more real and pressing than any professional code of conduct. "No," he said, the word firmer than he expected. "My car is in the garage downstairs. It's still raining and it's no trouble at all. I'll drive you." She finally turned to face him fully, her expression a mixture of surprise and something else. Apprehension. "Ethan, you don't have to do that. It's out of your way." "I insist," he said, his gaze holding hers, trying to convey a simple, uncomplicated kindness that he did not feel. What he felt was complicated, a tangled mess of protectiveness, desire, and a selfish need to extend their time together if only for a few more minutes. The battle in her eyes lasted only a moment before she relented, giving a small, almost imperceptible nod. The walk to the underground garage was an exercise in tension. The only sounds were their footsteps echoing on the concrete, the distant hum of the building's ventilation system. The clinical world, with its rules and its daylight, was officially behind them. He unlocked the doors to his car, a sleek, dark gray sedan that, like his clinic, was immaculate and understatedly successful. The smell of clean leather and the faint neutral scent of the air freshener enveloped them as they settled inside, the heavy thud of the doors sealing them in. He started the engine, its low, powerful hum, a comforting sound in the quiet garage. He asked for her address, and she recited it in a low voice, a street name in one of Boston's wealthier suburbs. He keyed it into the navigation system, and the automated female voice that announced the route felt like a jarring intrusion into their private world. As they ascended the ramp and merged into the rain-swept city streets, a heavy silence fell between them. The only sound was the hypnotic, rhythmic thump and swish of the windshield wipers pushing away the rain, a metronome counting down the seconds of their stolen time. Ethan kept his eyes on the road, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. He was intensely, painfully aware of her in the passenger seat. He could feel the warmth of her presence, see her reflection ghosted in the side window, her face illuminated in fleeting flashes of neon and the headlights of passing cars. Her confession replayed in his mind on a loop. Sometimes I feel like I'm a part of the decor. He risked a quick glance at her. She was staring out the window, her profile a perfect, sad silhouette. What was she thinking about? About her husband? About him? About the life she was returning to? The car was a moving confessional, a hermetically sealed bubble of intimacy. The blurred, streaking lights of the city outside made it feel as though they were the only two people in the world. He wanted to say something, anything, to break the tension, but all the words felt wrong. Are you okay? Too personal, nice weather we're having, too absurd. And so they drove in silence, a silence that was more charged and articulate than any conversation could ever be. Soon, the dense urban landscape gave way to manicured lawns and large imposing houses set far back from the road. The navigation system announced they had arrived. He turned into a sweeping, circular driveway, the headlights catching on the wet slate of a grand entryway. The house was beautiful, a modern colonial, architecturally perfect, with large windows and meticulously landscaped gardens. Lights were on inside, painting warm, yellow squares onto the glistening driveway, but it looked staged, like a photograph in a magazine. It had the appearance of a home, but it radiated a deep, profound emptiness. He put the car in park and killed the engine. The sudden, absolute silence was deafening, broken only by the soft, gentle patter of rain on the car's roof. "Well," he said, the words sounding loud in the quiet. "Here you are." "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Thank you again, Ethan, for everything." She should have opened the door. He should have waited for her to do so. It was the end of the ride, the end of the evening, but neither of them moved. Time seemed to stretch and warp, each second hanging heavy and thick with unspoken words. He turned to look at her. Her face was pale in the dim glow of the dashboard lights, her eyes wide and dark. He could see the conflict in them, the gratitude warring with confusion, the loneliness warring with a fear of what was happening between them. The rational part of his brain, the part that had earned a doctorate and built a successful practice, was screaming a single frantic word: stop. But the rest of him, the part that had been dormant for 10 years and had been violently reawakened, was no longer listening. He saw the faint moisture on her lips from where she'd been nervously biting them. He saw the pulse fluttering at the base of her throat. He saw a woman who was drowning, and he was drowning with her. In a motion that felt both shockingly fast and agonizingly slow, he leaned across the center console. There was no thought, no decision, only an overwhelming, irresistible pull, a surrender to a force that had become too powerful to fight. His lips met hers. It was soft at first, a hesitant, questioning touch. It was a breath, not a kiss. He felt her sharp intake of air, the moment of absolute stillness where she could have pulled back, could have ended it. She didn't. Instead, she let out a slow, shuddering sigh and leaned into him. Her hand, cool and trembling, came up to cup his jaw, and the kiss changed. It deepened, becoming hungry, desperate, a release of all the tension that had been coiling between them for weeks. It tasted of rain and tea and a decade of unspoken longing. It was clumsy and frantic, a collision of need and regret, of loneliness seeking a cure in another's loneliness. It was a catastrophic, beautiful mistake. Just as quickly as it began, it was over. They pulled apart, gasping, the sound of their ragged breaths filling the small car. He stared at her, his heart hammering against his ribs. Reality crashed down with the force of a physical blow. The imposing house behind her, the gleaming gold band on her finger, the sacred, shattered trust between a doctor and his patient. Her eyes were wide, filled with a dawning horror that mirrored his own. For a split second, they were frozen, trapped in the wreckage of what they had just done. Then, without a word, without a backward glance, she fumbled for the door handle, pushed it open, and fled. He watched her run through the rain, a lone figure disappearing into the warm, empty light of her perfect home. The heavy front door clicked shut behind her, a sound of absolute finality. Ethan sat alone in the darkness and the silence, the engine cold. His lips tingled. The scent of her perfume lingered in the air, and the quiet, orderly world he had so carefully constructed lay in ruins around him. The 7 days that followed the kiss were a slow, meticulous form of torture. Ethan existed in a state of suspended animation, a ghost haunting the hallways of his own life. He saw his patients, went through the precise, familiar motions of his work, but his mind was elsewhere, trapped in the suffocating intimacy of his car, replaying that single, catastrophic moment on an endless loop. The taste of her lips, the shocked look in her eyes, the sound of her car door closing it was all seared into his memory. Sleep offered no escape. His dreams were a chaotic fever of desire and guilt. During the day, he found himself staring at his computer screen, the clinic schedule a glowing tableau of his impending doom. Her name, Isabella Rossi, 4:30 p.m., Friday, was not just an appointment, it was a verdict waiting to be delivered. Each time the phone rang, his stomach clenched, expecting it to be her, canceling, ending this madness before it could truly begin. A part of him, the sane, rational doctor, Carter, prayed for that call. But another more powerful part of him, the boy who had watched her from the front row and the man who had just tasted a forbidden dream, dreaded it with every fiber of his being. The silence from her was absolute. No email, no call, no text. It was a silence that grew louder and more significant with each passing day, a void that he filled with 1,000 different frantic scenarios. Friday arrived like a day of execution. By 4 o'clock, he was a wreck, his professional composure stretched to its breaking point. He was certain she wouldn't come. The kiss had been a mistake, a momentary lapse of judgment in a rainstorm, and she had spent the week regretting it, rebuilding her defenses. It was for the best. At 4:25, he was in his office, staring at the clock, when the intercom buzzed, Sarah's cheerful voice, a brutal counterpoint to his inner turmoil. "Doctor, Carter, your 4:30 is here." The words hit him like a physical blow. He felt the air leave his lungs, and for a terrifying second, the room tilted. She was here. She had come. The silence of the past week hadn't been a rejection. It had been a period of consideration, and her presence in his waiting room was her answer. He stood, his legs feeling unsteady, and walked the long hallway to the treatment room. The journey felt miles long. He pushed the door open. She was there, sitting on the edge of the therapy table, wearing a simple navy blue dress. She looked pale, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, but when she looked up at him, her gaze was steady, unwavering, and filled with a terrifying resolve that mirrored his own. The session was a masterpiece of denial, a fragile, transparent charade. They were two actors performing a play for an audience of ghosts, their movements stiff, their lines clipped. He began the routine stretches, his hands shaking almost imperceptibly as he made contact with her arm. The clinical touch was a lie, a profanity. Last week, he had imagined what her skin felt like. Now, he knew. He knew the softness of her lips, the exact way she sighed when she was touched. Every professional movement was haunted by the memory of that raw, personal kiss. The air was so thick with unspoken words it felt hard to breathe. The normal, gentle hum of the clinic was gone, replaced by a roaring silence. He was aware of everything: the soft rustle of her dress as she shifted, the quiet, unsteady rhythm of her breathing, the way she carefully avoided his eyes. He worked in a focused, almost frantic silence, moving through the exercises with a mechanical efficiency that was its own kind of madness. The 45 minutes stretched into an eternity. Finally, it was over. He had done all he could do for her shoulder. He stepped back, putting a deliberate, professional space between them, a last, desperate attempt to salvage the wreckage. "Okay, that's all for today, Mrs. Rossi," he said, the formal name sounding absurd, a word from a different lifetime. "You can schedule your next appointment at the front desk on your way out." It was a dismissal, an escape hatch. He was giving her a way out, a chance for them both to retreat from the edge of the cliff. She didn't move. She just sat on the table, looking at him, her dark eyes finally meeting his. The silence hummed, vibrated, and then snapped. "Stop," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the tension in the room like a surgeon's scalpel. "Stop calling me that." And that was it. The play was over. The charade was done. The last thread of his control, of his professionalism, of the man he was supposed to be, disintegrated into nothing. He crossed the room in 2 long strides, his body moving on pure, undeniable instinct. This kiss was not like the first. There was no hesitation, no question. It was a collision, a desperate, hungry confirmation of everything that had been simmering between them. His hands tangled in her hair, pulling her face to his, and her arms wrapped around his neck, pulling him down. It was a kiss of shared guilt and mutual surrender. He pushed her back, her body hitting the wall with a soft thud, his body pinning hers, claiming the space between them. It wasn't enough. He pulled back from her lips, both of them breathing in ragged, painful gasps, and his eyes, dark with a desire that had been denied for a decade, fell to the buttons of her dress. His fingers, usually so steady and precise, fumbled with them, driven by a clumsy, frantic haste. One button, then the next. The navy blue fabric fell away to reveal a bra made of black, intricate lace. It was a deliberate choice, a stark, sensual contrast to the conservative dress she wore. It was a secret she had carried with her into his clinic, a silent admission that she knew, just as he did, where this day was heading. A weak, breathless sound escaped her lips. "Ethan, wait, your office, here." Her protest was a ghost, a mere formality in the face of the inferno consuming them. "I don't care," he growled, his voice a low, raw thing he didn't recognize. He pressed his lips to the hollow of her throat. "I've waited 10 years for this." He lifted her then, her legs wrapping around his waist as he carried her the few feet to the therapy table and laid her down on the cool, unforgiving leather. The clinical setting was no longer a barrier. It was part of the transgression, a sacred space they were about to defile. The sound of his belt buckle unfastening was loud and sharp in the quiet room, a point of no return. Clothes were pushed aside, not removed, in a desperate, animalistic need for contact. Her initial, faint sounds of protest, the whispered "no, we must stop," quickly melted away, transforming into deep, throaty moans as his hands and mouth rediscovered her body, not as a doctor assessing an injury, but as a man starved for a touch he had only ever dreamed of. The encounter was not gentle or slow. It was a frantic, almost violent release of a pressure that had been building for a lifetime, a decade of silent adoration, a week of agonizing tension, and a moment of shared, catastrophic decision. It was the desperate, messy, beautiful, and terrible act of 2 people choosing to drown together, rather than continue to be lonely on their separate shores. Afterwards, they lay tangled in the wreckage, the cool air of the air-conditioned room raising goosebumps on their heated skin. The frantic passion receded like a tidal wave, leaving a deafening, terrifying silence in its wake. The reality of what they had done, of where they had done it, settled over them like a shroud. This was it. The point of no return had been crossed, and neither of them had any idea what lay on the other side. The aftermath of their transgression was not a storm of regret, but a deafening, hollow silence. They dressed with fumbling, awkward movements in the dim light of the treatment room, not looking at each other, the air thick with the scent of sex and the weight of their shared guilt. She left without a word, and Ethan was left alone in the wreckage of his professional sanctuary, the cool leather of the therapy table, a silent witness to his fall. For 2 days, he existed in a new kind of limbo, a state beyond the anxiety of waiting, a place of grim certainty. He had crossed the point of no return. The question was no longer if something would happen, but what would happen now. The answer came on Sunday evening in the form of a simple text message from a number he didn't recognize. "It's Isabella." "Are you okay?" His fingers trembled as he typed his reply. "I'm not sure. Are you?" A moment later, 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then reappeared. Finally, her message came through. A number. "But I need to see you again. Somewhere else. Not the clinic." And just like that, the guilt and fear were consumed by a dizzying, intoxicating wave of pure, unadulterated desire. This was not a mistake to be forgotten. It was a secret to be kept. The therapy sessions became their cover, a perfectly crafted piece of theater. On the surface, everything was as it should be. He was Dr. Carter, meticulously working on her shoulder. She was Mrs. Rossi, a diligent patient. But underneath the clinical veneer, a secret world thrived. Their hands would brush when he passed her a resistance band, the contact lasting a second too long. While guiding her through a stretch, he would lean in close, his lips near her ear, and whisper not medical instructions, but the time and room number of a boutique hotel across town. Her quiet okay was both an acknowledgement of her exercise regimen and an acceptance of his illicit invitation. They became experts in the art of the double meaning, their clinical conversations, a coded language of longing. This shared deception was a powerful aphrodisiac, binding them together in a conspiracy of two. The risk, the lies, the constant, humming thread of discovery, it all fed the intoxicating fire between them. They were playing with a flame that could incinerate both their lives, and the danger only made them feel more alive. He booked a room at the Marlowe, a chic, anonymous hotel tucked away on a quiet side street, a place where discretion was part of the decor. He got there first, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The room was beautiful, decorated in cool shades of gray and silver, with a king-sized bed dressed in crisp white linens and a floor-to-ceiling window offering a breathtaking view of the Charles River. But he barely noticed. He just paced, waiting, the anxiety and anticipation, a thrilling, terrifying cocktail in his veins. Then, a soft knock on the door. He opened it, and all the air left his lungs. It was Isabella, but not the patient in cashmere sweaters or the teacher from his memories. She was wearing a simple black coat, but when he helped her take it off, she was wearing a sleeveless dress of deep crimson red. The color was a bold, unapologetic statement. It clung to her body, outlining the elegant curve of her hips and the slim line of her waist. She had stepped out of her life and into this room as someone new, someone he had never met before. Someone made for this. He was speechless. He could only stare, taking in the sight of her. The red dress, her dark hair, the nervous, defiant look in her eyes. "You are so beautiful, Isabella," he finally breathed, the words feeling inadequate. He reached out, not to pull her into a desperate embrace, but to gently cup her face, his thumb stroking her cheek. The frantic energy of their first encounter was gone, replaced by a slow, simmering intensity. He wanted to savor this, to memorize every detail. A small, vulnerable smile touched her lips. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for a moment. "Make me forget everything, Ethan," she whispered, her voice a plea. It was the heart of her desire laid bare, not just for pleasure, but for oblivion. She wanted to erase her quiet house, her absent husband, her carefully curated life. For a few hours, in this room, she just wanted to be Isabella, and he was the only one who could give her that. He led her further into the room, towards the bed. He turned her around gently, and, with hands that were now steady, he reached for the zipper at the back of her red dress. The slow, deliberate sound of it unzipping was the only sound in the room. He pushed the fabric off her shoulders, letting the dress pool in a scarlet circle at her feet, leaving her standing before him in nothing but a delicate set of black lace lingerie that he now knew she had bought just for this, just for him. He took his time, exploring her body with a reverence that bordered on worship. This was a discovery, a slow unveiling of a masterpiece he had only ever admired from afar. His hands traced the line of her waist, the gentle flare of her hips, learning the shape and feel of her. He knelt before her, his lips finding the soft skin of her stomach, making her gasp. He unhooked her bra and tossed it aside, freeing her breasts. He took their weight in his hands, admiring their full, round shape, the pale, soft skin. He remembered the user's manual requests, but the act felt more profound now. It was a testament to a beauty he'd longed to witness. This was not the frantic coupling on a cold leather table. This was a slow, deliberate act of devotion. They fell onto the bed, onto the cool, clean sheets, and for the next few hours, the world outside the hotel room ceased to exist. Their lovemaking was a slow, languid dance. It was a conversation spoken in touch and taste and sound, a meticulous exploration of pleasure. He learned the exact spot behind her ear that made her shiver, the way she arched her back when he kissed the inside of her thigh. She learned the strength in his hands, the way he liked her to whisper his name in the dark. The sounds she made were not of protest or desperation, but of pure, unadulterated bliss, soft moans and sharp, breathless cries that he swallowed with his own. They were drunk on each other, intoxicated by the freedom of their anonymity. In this room, they were not a doctor and his married patient. They were just Ethan and Isabella, two people who had found a temporary, beautiful, and dangerous refuge in each other's arms. Later, they lay tangled in the white sheets, the setting sun painting the room in hues of orange and gold. They talked, they laughed, they even ordered room service, eating club sandwiches in bed like rebellious teenagers. For a fleeting, perfect afternoon, they were normal. But as the sky outside darkened to a deep indigo, reality began to seep back in under the door. She glanced at the clock on the bedside table, and the spell was broken. "I have to go," she said softly, the words heavy with the life she had to return to. They dressed in silence, putting their costumes back on. He, the successful young doctor. She, the respectable wife. At the door, he kissed her. A long, deep kiss that tasted of regret and the promise of their next secret meeting. They left the hotel separately, melting back into the city, leaving their perfect temporary world behind in room 712. The intoxication had taken hold, and neither of them had any desire to be sober. The affair settled into a rhythm, a secret cadence that beat just beneath the surface of their ordinary lives. The clandestine meetings in the hushed, anonymous elegance of hotel rooms became their reality, the only reality that felt true. The world of her marriage and his practice became the dream, a pale, distant imitation of life. It was in the quiet hours after their passion had subsided, when they were tangled in sheets that didn't belong to them, that a new kind of intimacy began to grow. With their bodies satisfied, their minds were free to wander, to explore the strange, winding path that had led them here. It was on one such afternoon, with the gray Boston skyline softening into dusk outside their window, that the ghost of their shared past finally entered the room. Ethan was lying on his side, watching her sleep, her face soft and unguarded in the dim light. He reached out, his fingers gently tracing the curve of her collarbone. Her eyes fluttered open, a slow, lazy smile touching her lips as she focused on him. He smiled back, a genuine, easy smile that only ever seemed to exist within the four walls of these rooms. "You know," he said, his voice a low murmur, "if you could go back in time and show a picture of this moment to 17-year-old me, sitting in your English class," his brain would have melted and leaked out of his ears. A soft laugh escaped her, a warm, lovely sound. She shifted, turning to face him, pulling the sheet up to her chin. "Oh? Was it that bad?" "Bad?" he chuckled, shaking his head. "Isabella, it was a clinical, terminal stage case of hero worship with a side of unbearable, unspoken adolescent agony. I was a goner." He was joking, but the truth of it resonated between them. He had never spoken of it, and she had never asked, but the crush he'd had on her was the foundation of their story, the silent, powerful engine that had driven them to this point. "I arranged my entire schedule in senior year to make sure I got into your AP Lit class," he confessed, the words spilling out now that the door was open. "I always sat in the front row, on the left, because I noticed that's the side of the room you tended to stand on when you were really passionate about something. I read every book you assigned twice, trying to find some hidden meaning that would impress you. Your class was the only reason I got out of bed some mornings." He said it all with a light, self-deprecating tone, but the intensity of the memory was real. He was laying a piece of his younger self at her feet, a vulnerable, heartfelt confession. She didn't laugh or dismiss it. She listened, her dark eyes soft and serious, and when he was finished, a profound quiet settled over them. She reached out, her hand coming to rest on his chest, right over his heart. "I knew, you know," she said, her voice barely a whisper, Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He had always assumed he'd been invisible, just another face in a sea of students, his adoration a secret he had guarded perfectly. You did?" "Oh, Ethan," she said, a tender, melancholic smile on her face. "Of course I knew. A teacher knows, especially a literature teacher who is trained to look for subtext." She shifted, propping herself up on her elbow, the sheet falling to her waist, and for a moment he was distracted by the soft curve of her hip, the elegant line of her back. "You weren't exactly subtle," she continued, her fingers now tracing idle patterns on his skin. "Most of the students were either bored or terrified or trying to figure out the minimum amount of work they needed to do to pass. But you were different. You were the quiet, intense boy in the front row who always looked like you were actually thinking about the words, like they mattered. You never tried to show off, but when I asked a question, I could see you turning it over in your mind. And yes, I saw the way you looked at me." He was mesmerized, hearing the past retold from her perspective. He had been so wrapped up in his own feelings, he had never once considered what she might have seen. "What did you think?" he asked, his voice suddenly small. "Honestly?" She paused, choosing her words with the care of the teacher she used to be. "I thought it was sweet. And, to be perfectly honest, it was flattering. Some days, when I felt like I was failing, like nothing I said was getting through to anyone, I would look at you, and you would be hanging on every word. It was a comfort. A reminder that what I was doing mattered to at least one person. You were my serious young man in a room full of children." The phrase, "my serious young man," sent a strange, possessive thrill through him. It implied a connection, a special status that he had held even then. The silence returned, and he dared to ask the question that had been buried deep inside him for a decade. "Did you ever—" He couldn't finish it. The thought was too transgressive, too impossible. She knew what he was asking. She shook her head, her expression gentle but firm. "No, Ethan. Never. You were a child. You were my student. And I took that responsibility very seriously." That was a line that never, ever would have been crossed. He felt a pang of something disappointment, relief. But then she continued. "But," she said, her gaze softening, "I did see something, a potential, a depth that was unusual in a boy your age, an old soul. I remember wondering, more than once, what kind of man you would grow into." Her words were a revelation. Their connection wasn't a new, sudden thing born of opportunity and loneliness. It was a seed that had been planted 10 years ago, a story that had been left unfinished. This new knowledge recontextualized their affair, making it feel less like a sordid, random transgression and more like a fate, an inevitability. "It's strange," he said, thinking aloud. "All that time, you were the one with all the power, all the authority. And then you walked into my clinic, in pain, and suddenly I was the one who was supposed to be in charge, the professional, the one with the answers. And now?" she asked, her eyes searching his. He looked around the anonymous hotel room, at their clothes discarded on a chair, at the rumpled sheets that held the scent of their bodies. "And now," he said, "I have no idea who's in charge. I think we've both lost that. The ghosts of the past were now fully present in the room with them, the quiet, adoring boy, the brilliant, responsible teacher. Those two innocent specters watched the two flawed, tangled adults in the bed and cast a long, complicated shadow. The conversation had brought them closer, weaving their past into the fabric of their present, giving their affair a sense of history, of depth. But it was also unsettling. It made what they were doing feel bigger, more significant, and therefore more dangerous. It wasn't just an escape from an unhappy marriage or the fulfillment of a long-held fantasy. It felt like the closing of a circle that had been drawn a decade ago. He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair, inhaling her scent. He was holding Isabella, his lover, but he was also holding the ghost of Mrs. Rossi, his teacher. The two had merged into one, a beautiful, brilliant, and impossibly dangerous woman who held his past and his present in the palm of her hand, and he knew he would do anything to keep from losing her. The intoxication could not last. Like any potent drug, the initial, dizzying euphoria of the affair inevitably began to give way to a more sobering reality. The thrill of the forbidden, while still powerful, was now accompanied by a low, humming undercurrent of anxiety, a ghost at the feast. For Ethan, the carefully constructed walls separating the different parts of his life began to feel terrifyingly thin. At his clinic, a patient's casual mention of their spouse would send a jolt of guilt through him. At home, in the sterile quiet of his apartment, the loneliness he had once sought to cure with Isabella's presence now felt deeper, more acute, tainted by the knowledge that his relief was borrowed from another man's life. Their hotel rooms, once sanctuaries of passion and escape, started to feel like gilded cages, temporary and fragile. The affair had become a routine, and within that routine, the cracks began to appear. The moment of reckoning came on a Tuesday afternoon, in a room at the Four Seasons overlooking the public garden. The light was soft. The mood was meant to be languid. They had made love with a practiced, familiar ease, a testament to the intimacy they had built. Afterwards, Isabella went to take a shower, leaving the peaceful quiet of the bathroom and the gentle sound of running water in her wake. Ethan lay in the rumpled bed, his head propped up on a pillow, feeling the pleasant exhaustion in his limbs. He felt a sense of contentment, a temporary peace. And then it happened. Her phone, which she had carelessly left on the bedside table, buzzed against the dark wood. The screen lit up, a sharp, unwelcome rectangle of light in the dim, sleepy room. Ethan's eyes were drawn to it, an involuntary, fatal curiosity. He didn't mean to look, but he did. The name on the screen was simple, stark, and utterly devastating: Mark. And beneath it, a message that was so brutally, painfully mundane, it felt like a physical blow. Hey, meeting with the Henderson group is running late. Don't wait up for dinner. The ticket for the dry cleaning is on the counter by the keys. Love you. Ethan stared at the screen, his blood turning to ice. The ticket for the dry cleaning. The words echoed in his head. It wasn't a jealous rage or a suspicious interrogation. It was the casual domestic intimacy of a shared life. A life of errands and keys on the counter and dinners and love yous. A life that happened every single day, in the hours and minutes before and after she was here, with him. In that moment, Mark ceased to be an abstract concept, a faceless, neglectful husband from Isabella's stories. He became a real person, a person who had meetings, who left notes, who loved his wife. And Ethan? Ethan was the man his wife was cheating with in a $400 a night hotel room. The romance, the faded connection, the story they had been telling themselves, it all evaporated, leaving behind a sordid, ugly cliche. The shame was a physical thing, a wave of nausea that churned in his stomach. He looked around the room, and for the first time, he saw it not as their secret haven, but as a crime scene. Her navy blue dress was draped over a chair. Her sensible leather purse sat on the desk. They were props from her real life, a life in which he was a dangerous, dirty secret. The phone screen went dark, but the message was burned onto the back of his eyelids. When Isabella emerged from the bathroom, wrapped in a fluffy white hotel robe, her hair damp and her face flushed and beautiful from the steam, she found a different man than the one she had left. She smiled, a radiant, carefree smile that twisted the knife in his gut. "The shower in here is incredible," she said, toweling her hair. "I feel like a new woman." He tried to smile back, but it felt like a grimace. He sat up, pulling the sheet around his waist. He was suddenly acutely aware of his own nakedness. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her smile faltering as she sensed the shift in the atmosphere. "You look pale." "I'm fine," he lied, his voice flat. "Just thinking." She came and sat on the edge of the bed, her familiar scent of soap and lavender filling the space between them. She was still high on their escape, her mind free from the constraints of her other life. She leaned in to kiss him, but he subtly turned his head so her lips landed on his cheek. She pulled back, a flicker of hurt in her eyes. "What is it, Ethan?" He couldn't tell her he had seen the text. He couldn't admit to the violation, couldn't give voice to the ugly reality it represented. So he deflected. "I was just thinking about the risk," he said, the words sounding lame even to his own ears, "about being careful." Isabella sighed, a sound of gentle exasperation. She was still in their fantasy, while he had been brutally ejected from it. "I'm tired of being careful, Ethan," she said, her voice low and passionate. "My whole life is careful. My house is careful. My marriage is careful. This," she said, gesturing around the room, at the rumpled bed, at them, "this is the one place I don't want to be careful." She took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "I was thinking," she began, her eyes bright with a new dangerous idea. "What if we went away, just for a night, a weekend? We could drive up the coast to Maine, find a little inn by the sea. No one would know us. We could pretend." "Pretend what?" he snapped, his anxiety making his tone sharper than he intended. "Pretend we're normal? Pretend you don't have a husband who leaves you notes about the dry cleaning?" The words were out before he could stop them. Her face went slack with shock, her hand dropping from his. She stared at him, her expression shifting from confusion to a dawning, horrified understanding. She glanced at her phone on the nightstand, then back at him. "You saw. It wasn't a question." "Isabella, we can't go away for a weekend," he said, his voice softer now, pleading. "It's insane. It's reckless. Getting a hotel room for a few hours is one thing, but disappearing for a weekend? How would you explain that? What would you tell him?" "I would lie," she said, her voice cold, her hurt hardening into defiance. "It's what people in our situation do, isn't it? I've become a very good liar, thanks to you." The words were a slap in the face. She saw his caution, not as a desire to protect them, but as a weakness, a rejection. She saw him as a coward, afraid to want more. He saw her as dangerously naive, recklessly ignoring the very real consequences that were breathing down their necks. The pleasure they had shared just an hour before was gone, replaced by the bitter taste of recrimination. The cracks were no longer invisible hairline fractures. They were deep, gaping fissures. The rest of their time together was strained and silent. They dressed, the simple act now feeling like they were putting on armor for the separate battles of their lives. When they left the hotel, walking out into the bright, indifferent afternoon sun, they didn't touch. The easy intimacy was gone. He walked her to the corner before they parted ways to go in opposite directions. "I'll see you Friday," he said, referring to her next appointment. "Of course," she replied, her tone clipped and unreadable. He watched her walk away, a beautiful, elegant woman disappearing into the crowd, on her way back to a life where there were keys on the counter and dry cleaning to be picked up. The intoxication was over. The hangover had begun, and for the first time, he was terrified. The argument from their last meeting had left a festering wound, a space of coldness and misunderstanding between them, but the addiction was stronger than the resentment. By the time Isabella's Friday appointment arrived, the need for their escape, for the intoxicating oblivion they found in each other, had overridden the caution and the conflict. The session began with a fragile truce. They didn't speak of her husband, or of weekends in Maine. They fell back into their familiar ritual, the quiet, coded intimacy of the therapy session. But the recklessness Isabella had craved had now infected him too. The fear, for a moment, had been replaced by a defiant hunger. At the end of the session, after the stretches and the exercises, he locked the treatment room door. They came together not with the slow, sensual discovery of their hotel afternoons, but with a desperate, almost angry passion. It was a frantic reaffirmation of their secret world, a silent, shared vow to keep the encroaching reality at bay. They were careless, lost in the heat of a desire that had become more about defiance than pleasure. They were lying on the therapy table, tangled together in a mess of limbs and half-discarded clothing, the air thick with the aftermath of their passion. Isabella was tracing a line down his chest, a soft, contented smile on her face. The outside world felt a million miles away. And then, the sound. A sharp electronic buzz that cut through the quiet intimacy like a gunshot. The intercom. Ethan froze, every muscle in his body tensing. It was after 5, his last patient, Isabella, was finished. Sarah, his receptionist, should have gone home. His mind raced. Who could it be? He reached over, his movements stiff, and pressed the talk button. Yes, Sarah? Dr. Carter? Her voice was cheerful, oblivious, a sound from a different, saner universe. Sorry to bother you, I was just about to head out. Mrs. Rossi's husband is here in the waiting room to pick her up. He said he wanted to surprise her. The words detonated in the silent room. Husband. Here. Surprise. Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. He looked at Isabella. Her eyes were wide with a terror so profound it stole her breath. Her contented smile had vanished, replaced by a mask of pure, animal panic. For a heart-stopping second, they could only stare at each other, trapped, naked, and exposed. The reality they had been so desperate to defy had not just knocked on the door, it had kicked it down and was standing in the waiting room. "Oh my God," Isabella whispered, the words a prayer of despair. She scrambled off the table, her movements frantic, as she grabbed for her dress. "Mark! He's here!" "Oh my God, Ethan, what do we do?" Ethan's mind, usually so calm and analytical, was a white-hot storm of panic. His career, his license, his entire life, he could see it all crumbling to dust. The room, once their sanctuary, now felt like a trap, the walls closing in. He could smell her perfume, the scent of their lovemaking, hanging heavy in the air. Could Mark smell it? Would he know? The paranoid thoughts came fast and sharp. He forced himself to breathe, to think. He was the doctor. He had to be in control. He pressed the intercom button again, praying his voice wouldn't betray the terror that was strangling him. "Thanks, Sarah," he said, amazed at how steady he sounded. "Just finishing up some final assessments on her shoulder mobility. We'll be out in 5 minutes." He turned to Isabella, grabbing her by the shoulders. Her whole body was trembling. "Listen to me," he said, his voice a low, urgent whisper. "Look at me. Breathe." She looked at him, her eyes wild. "We need to be calm. You are my patient. I am your doctor. We were just finishing your session. We were discussing your treatment plan. That is all that happened. Do you understand?" She nodded, a jerky, convulsive movement. While she frantically fixed her dress, buttoning it up to her throat, he pulled on his own clothes, his fingers feeling clumsy and foreign. He smoothed his shirt, ran a hand through his hair. Did he look like a man who had just had sex? He quickly grabbed the clipboard from the counter, clicking his pen, creating the illusion of work. "Do one of the stretches," he hissed. "The one against the wall." She moved to the wall, her back to the door, pressing her arm across her chest in a parody of a physical therapy exercise. They were staging a scene, 2 terrified actors in a play for their lives. He took one final steadying breath. "Ready?" She nodded without turning around. He unlocked the door and stepped out into the hallway, his heart pounding a violent, painful rhythm against his ribs. The walk to the reception area was the longest of his life. Every detail was heightened, surreal. The scuff mark on the floor, the hum of the overhead lights, the faint smell of cleaning supplies. He saw him before Isabella did. A man, tall and well-built, was standing by the window, looking out at the street. He was wearing an expensive-looking suit, his dark hair perfectly styled. He turned as he heard them approach, and a broad, confident smile spread across his face. It was a handsome, friendly face, which somehow made it all the more terrifying. "There she is," the man said, his voice warm. Isabella forced a smile that was a grotesque caricature of her real one. "Mark, what a surprise. What are you doing here?" "Finished up at the office early and thought I'd save you the drive home," he said, walking towards her. He was completely oblivious, radiating an easy charm that made Ethan's skin crawl. Ethan knew he couldn't hide. He had to step into the scene. He put on his Dr. Carter face, a mask of calm professionalism, and extended a hand. "Mark, it's a pleasure to finally meet you. I'm Ethan Carter." Mark took his hand, his grip firm and dry. "Likewise, doctor. Thanks for taking such good care of my wife. She says you're a miracle worker." The irony was so thick Ethan felt like he was choking on it. He was shaking the hand of the man he was betraying, a man who was thanking him for it. Not at all, Ethan managed to say, his own smile feeling like cracking plaster. We were just finishing up. Mrs. Rossi is making excellent progress. Her range of motion has improved significantly. He was spewing clinical jargon, words as a shield, a desperate attempt to reinforce the lie. Mark put his arm around Isabella's waist, a casual, proprietary gesture that made Ethan's stomach clench with a feeling so intense and ugly he couldn't name it. Well, I don't want to keep you, doctor, Mark said. Ready to go, honey? Isabella just nodded, unable to speak. She wouldn't look at Ethan. She couldn't. As they walked towards the door, Mark turned back one last time. Seriously, Doc, we appreciate it. It's good to know she's in good hands. And then they were gone. The clinic door chimed softly as it closed behind them, leaving Ethan alone in the deafening silence of the reception area. The adrenaline drained out of him in a sudden, violent rush, leaving him feeling weak and hollow. He stumbled back to his office, locked the door, and leaned against it, his forehead pressed against the cool wood. He finally let out the breath he felt like he had been holding for an hour, a ragged, shuddering gasp. The fantasy was over. The risk was no longer a thrilling aphrodisiac. It was a man in a nice suit with a friendly smile who had just shaken his hand. Their secret world wasn't a sanctuary, it was a cage, and the door had just slammed shut. The near miss with Mark had been a shock to the system, a jolt of ice-cold reality that had sobered them from their long intoxication. The week that followed was a week of quiet terror. For Ethan, every unexpected ring of the phone, every time a patient brought their spouse to an appointment, was a fresh spike of paranoia. He was haunted by the memory of Mark's firm handshake, the friendly, oblivious words of thanks. The guilt was no longer a dull ache in the background. It was a sharp, active presence, a third person in his life. Their communication dwindled to brief, logistical texts, to confirm her next and what he knew had to be her final appointment. The easy intimacy, the secret jokes, the shared longing, all of it had been burned away by the white-hot panic of near discovery. Fear had poisoned the well. Her last official therapy session was a hollow, tragic performance. They moved through the familiar exercises in a strained, mournful silence. His touch, which had once been a source of illicit, trembling excitement, was now studiously, painfully clinical. He was all business, his voice a neutral monotone as he measured her range of motion, his hands efficient and detached. He was hiding behind the role of Dr. Carter one last time, but it wasn't a defense against desire. It was a refuge from heartbreak. The air between them was heavy, with unspoken endings. They were like two people at a deathbed, unable to speak of the inevitable. Finally, after putting her through a final series of tests, he stepped back, holding his clipboard like a shield. Well, he began, his voice devoid of emotion. Your strength has returned to baseline and you have full pain-free range of motion. From a clinical perspective, your treatment is complete. There's no medical reason for you to continue scheduling appointments. The words, so professional and final, hung in the air like a death sentence. This was it. Their cover, their excuse, their entire carefully constructed artifice was gone. He had just officially discharged her not only as his patient, but as his lover. She looked at him, her eyes welling with tears she refused to let fall. She simply nodded, a slow, sad acceptance of the verdict. She gathered her things, her movements slow, as if a great weight had settled on her shoulders. At the door she paused, her hand on the knob. I can't, she whispered, her back still to him. I can't let this be how it ends. In here, like this. He closed his eyes, the pain of her words a physical blow. He knew she was right. They deserved more than this cold, sterile conclusion. The Marlowe, he said, his voice hoarse. Tonight, 8 o'clock. I'll be there, she replied, and then she was gone. The hotel room, their once cherished sanctuary, felt different this time. It felt funereal. The beautiful view of the city lights seemed to mock them, a reminder of a world they could never be a part of together. When he let her in, they didn't fall into a desperate, passionate embrace. They just stood there for a moment looking at each other, two ghosts haunting the scene of their former happiness. They made love one last time, but the character of the act had changed completely. The frantic, hungry passion was gone. The slow, sensual discovery was gone. What remained was a deep, heartbreaking tenderness, an act that felt more like a goodbye than a consummation. It was a slow, sad, clinging embrace, a desperate attempt to memorize the feel of each other's skin, the taste of each other's lips. It was filled with a sense of dread and finality, each touch an acknowledgement that it would be the last. There was no joy in it, only the profound, shared sorrow of a beautiful, broken thing coming to its inevitable end. Afterwards, they lay in the darkness, not touching, the space between them, a cold, unbridgeable chasm. The question they had so skillfully avoided for months finally surfaced, rising from the depths of their failure. "What are we doing, Ethan?" Isabella asked the ceiling, her voice fragile. "What have we been doing all this time?" The question demanded an answer, an honest one, free from the intoxicating illusions they had wrapped themselves in. "We've been hiding," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I was hiding from being alone. You were hiding from being lonely." She turned her head on the pillow to look at him, a single tear tracing a silver path down her temple. "I love you," she whispered. The words, which should have been a triumph, sounded like a tragedy. He felt a tear of his own escape, hot against his skin. "I love you too," he said, and it was the truest, most painful thing he had ever said. "But it doesn't matter." "It could," she said, a note of desperate hope in her voice. "It could matter. I could leave him." And there it was. The fantasy, voiced one last, futile time, the escape hatch she so desperately wanted to believe in. But the near miss with Mark had killed the fantasy for him. He saw the future she was proposing not as a romantic dream, but as a waking nightmare. "And then what, Isabella?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm, forcing them both to face the truth. "You leave him. You go through a messy, painful divorce, and we try to build a life together. On what foundation? A relationship that started when I was your doctor? A life that began with you betraying your husband and me violating every oath I ever took? It's poison. It's a rot at the very center of us. It would never survive the light of day. We would never survive it." He could feel her hopes dying in the darkness beside him. Everything he said was true, and they both knew it. The affair had only been able to exist in the shadows, in secret rooms and stolen hours. It was a beautiful, exotic flower that could not withstand the harsh, ordinary light of the real world. The weight of their actions, of the lies and the risks, and the inevitable pain they would cause, settled over them, suffocating the last embers of their passion. The pleasure was gone. All that was left was the bill, and it was terrifyingly high. There was nothing else to say. The truth, once spoken, could not be taken back. It had filled the room, leaving no space for dreams. They dressed in a silence that was heavier and more final than any they had shared before. At the door, he reached out and touched her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear. "I will never forget you, Isabella Rossi," he whispered. "You were the most beautiful chapter of my life." "And the saddest," she replied, her voice breaking. He leaned in and kissed her one last time. It wasn't a kiss of passion, but a kiss of farewell, chaste and heartbreaking, tasting of salt and sorrow, and the bitter finality of an ending. She pulled away, gave him one last long look, and then she turned and walked down the long, empty hotel corridor without looking back. Ethan stood in the doorway and watched her go until she disappeared around the corner, leaving him alone with the ghosts of what they had been and the crushing, unbearable weight of what they could never be. The end, when it came, was not a single cataclysmic event, but a slow, quiet bleeding out. In the months that followed their final, heartbreaking goodbye at the hotel, Ethan attempted to rebuild the life their affair had so thoroughly dismantled. He threw himself into his work with a renewed, almost punishing focus, his clinic becoming both his refuge and his prison. He went on dates with smart, beautiful, uncomplicated women who were not haunted by a past he couldn't speak of, who did not carry the scent of a loveless marriage on their skin. He would sit across from them in brightly lit restaurants, listening to their easy laughter, and feel nothing but a profound, hollow ache. They were not Isabella. They could never be Isabella. He learned that a person can function perfectly while a part of their soul has been permanently amputated. The raw, searing pain of the loss eventually faded, as all acute pain does, but it was replaced by something more permanent, a scar. It was a quiet phantom ache that would surface at unexpected moments when he heard a certain piece of classical music, when he saw a woman with dark chestnut hair in the street, when the first rain of a storm began to fall. Nearly a year had passed. The seasons had turned, and the fiery passion of their affair had cooled into the cold, gray winter of memory. He had accepted that he would not see her again. Their separate worlds, which had so dangerously collided, had spun back into their own orbits. He had heard nothing of her, and he assumed she had heard nothing of him. It was better that way. It was the only way. Then, on a cold, bright Saturday in November, he saw her. He was walking through the Boston Common, his coat collar turned up against the wind, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. The trees were bare, their skeletal branches stark against the pale blue sky, and across the wide, frozen lawn, near the frog pond, he saw a couple. He wouldn't have noticed them at all, except for the woman's posture and elegance, a certain way of holding her head that was as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. It was her. She was with Mark. They were walking side by side, but a small, almost imperceptible space remained between them, a testament to a distance that had nothing to do with feet and inches. He looked handsome and confident in a dark wool overcoat. She looked beautiful, as always, wrapped in a stylish camel-colored coat, a silk scarf at her neck. But as Ethan watched, frozen in place, he saw the same weariness in her shoulders that he had seen on the first day she walked into his clinic. She was a picture of perfect, quiet resignation. They were the image of a successful, elegant Boston couple out for a weekend stroll. They were a perfect, beautiful lie. Ethan's heart, which he had thought was so carefully scarred over, began to beat with a slow, heavy, painful rhythm. He had no desire to call out to her, to run to her. He only stood and watched, a ghost at the edge of her life. And then, as if she could feel the weight of his gaze from 100 yards away, she stopped. She turned her head, her eyes scanning the scattered people on the path, and for a single, breath-stealing, heart-stopping moment, her eyes found his. The world for an instant fell away. There was no park, no cold wind, no distant sound of traffic. There was only the silent, unbridgeable chasm between them and the look that passed across it. It was a look of pure, unadorned recognition. It held no anger, no blame, no longing. It held only the shared, secret, and terrible weight of their story. It was a look that said, "I remember you. I remember us." It was real. Mark, oblivious, said something to her, pointing at something in the distance. The spell was broken. She held Ethan's gaze for a second longer, a universe of unspoken words passing between them, and then she turned away. She gave no sign of acknowledgement, no smile, no nod. She simply turned her head, faced forward, and continued walking beside her husband, disappearing into the anonymous rhythm of her life. Ethan stood there long after they were gone, the cold wind biting at his face. He felt no anger, no fresh wave of heartbreak. The drama was over. All that was left was a profound, quiet, and bottomless sadness. He finally understood. Their story was never a love story in the traditional sense. It was a story about a brief, desperate, and beautiful collision. They were two lonely people who, for a short time, had made the other feel seen, had made the other feel alive in a way that their real lives never could. It was a fever dream, an intoxicating escape, and like all fevers, it had to break. It could never have survived in the light. He turned and began to walk away, his own path taking him in the opposite direction. He knew he would never forget her. She would always be a part of him, a ghost that walked beside him, a silent reminder of the man he had been and the choices he had made. Some stories don't have happy endings or sad endings. They just have endings. And you are left with the scars, not as a mark of what was broken, but as a testament to the fact that you survived something powerful enough to tear you apart, and that you are, somehow, still walking.